James Carter stood alone in the courtroom, facing a system designed to crush him, while Judge Marcus Holloway smirked from the bench, convinced this was just another open and shut case. But as the trial unfolded, laughter turned to silence, arrogance to fear, because James wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was about to expose the corruption that ran deeper than anyone dared to imagine, and when the truth finally came out, no one, not even the judge himself, would escape its consequences. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the defendant, James Carter, stood at the defense table. A black man in an orange jumpsuit facing multiple felony charges, and yet he was smiling. Not out of arrogance, but something different. Confidence. Defiance. Something that Judge Marcus Holloway, a man known for his condescending smirk and sharp tongue, found amusing. The judge leaned back in his chair, chuckling as he glanced over the file in front of him. Fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, the list went on. A textbook case, open and shut. The prosecution had stacked the evidence high, and James had no legal representation. His court-appointed attorney had withdrawn from the case just days before the trial, leaving him to fend for himself. And yet, when asked if he needed time to find another lawyer, he simply adjusted his glasses, squared his shoulders, and announced that he would represent himself. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The judge shook his head, tapping his gavel lightly. A man with no formal legal experience going up against a seasoned prosecutor? It was a joke, a tragedy even, and Holloway was already picturing the guilty verdict. He had seen men like James before. Arrogant, reckless, believing they could outsmart the system. They never did. The trial began, and the prosecution wasted no time laying out the evidence. Financial statements, recorded phone calls, emails linking James to a fraudulent scheme that had cost investors millions. Witnesses testified, pointing fingers, swearing under oath that James was the mastermind behind it all. It was neat, clean. Too clean. Then James stood up and the atmosphere shifted. His voice was steady, his words precise, he didn't stumble or hesitate, and as he cross-examined the witnesses, his strategy became clear. He wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling the case piece by piece. He pointed out inconsistencies, asked questions that forced the prosecution's witnesses to contradict their own statements. He challenged the authenticity of the financial records, hinting at tampering. His confidence never wavered, even when the prosecutor sneered and accused him of theatrics. But then came the moment no one expected. From a black briefcase, James pulled out a folder of documents. He moved deliberately, unfolding each piece of paper, laying them before the court as if revealing a slow, deadly truth. Bank transactions, hidden accounts, confidential emails. These weren't his records, they belonged to someone else. The real architects of the fraud. James wasn't the mastermind. He was the scapegoat. And now, with the evidence in front of them, the courtroom was beginning to see it. Judge Holloway's smirk faded. The prosecutor stiffened, his fingers tightening around his pen. James continued, his voice unwavering, exposing the corruption that had been buried beneath his case. The true criminals were not in the defendant's chair, but in high-rise offices behind government desks, executives, politicians, even lawyers who had carefully orchestrated the scheme. When James had realized what he had become a part of, he tried to step away. That was when the frame job began. Then he played the audio. A grainy recording echoed through the silent courtroom. Voices discussing forged documents, planting evidence, ensuring that James would take the fall. Among them was the voice of a high-profile senator, another belonging to the district attorney himself. The room was stunned. Even the judge, who had once laughed at James, now sat rigid in his chair. In the days that followed, things took a darker turn. One of James's key witnesses was found dead in his apartment. Official reports claimed it was a suicide, but the timing was too convenient. The lead investigator on the case disappeared without a trace. Inside the courtroom, security was increased, and the tensions was palpable. James, however, remained steady. He continued presenting evidence, revealing the web of deception strand by strand. Then the final blow. He produced a document that no one expected, a sealed file that implicated Judge Holloway himself. Bank transactions, secret dealings. The same man who had once laughed at him was now completely silent. The jury reached a verdict. Not guilty. James had won. But in the days following his release, he began to sense something was wrong. He had humiliated powerful figures, men who did not forget or forgive. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his apartment, shot twice in the chest. Officially, it was ruled a robbery gone wrong. But everyone knew the truth. James had uncovered the rot within the system, and for that, he paid the ultimate price. Yet his case sparked a ripple effect. Investigations followed, resignations, arrests. The men who thought they were untouchable found themselves exposed, and the judge who once mocked him, he resigned in disgrace. James had won the battle, but in the end, the war took him. James stood tall, his posture unshaken despite the weight of the accusations against him. The courtroom, once dismissive of his decision to represent himself, was now silent, hanging on to every word. The prosecutor, a man accustomed to crushing untrained defendants, expected an easy victory. He had spent years perfecting his aggressive approach, using legal jargon to intimidate and bury the accused under a mountain of seemingly irrefutable evidence. But something was different this time. James wasn't folding under pressure. He wasn't stumbling through his defense. He was tearing apart the prosecution's case with a precision that no one had anticipated. The state's first witness, a financial analyst, took the stand to explain how James had allegedly funneled stolen funds into offshore accounts. The prosecutor guided him through his testimony, painting James as a criminal mastermind who had orchestrated a complex scheme to defraud investors. The jury listened attentively, nodding as the analyst presented charts and bank records. On the surface, the evidence seemed undeniable. The judge, still holding on to his initial smugness, watched with amusement as James prepared to cross-examine the witness. Then the unexpected happened. James began pointing out discrepancies in the numbers. He questioned the methodology used to trace the transactions, exposing flaws in the analysis. The witness hesitated, thrown off by James's knowledge of financial law and investigative techniques. James pressed further, forcing the analyst to admit that some of the data had been provided by a third-party firm with direct ties to the prosecution. Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor quickly objected, but the damage had been done. Moving on, James turned his attention to the digital evidence, emails, text messages, and recorded phone calls that supposedly placed him at the center of the conspiracy. The prosecution played snippets of conversations, carefully edited to make it seem as though James was giving orders and directing illegal transactions. The jury listened intently, convinced they were hearing damning proof of his guilt. But James wasn't finished. He demanded the full recordings be played, not just the cherry-picked sections presented by the state. Reluctantly, the prosecutor complied. What followed was shocking. When played in their entirety, the recordings told a different story. James wasn't issuing orders. He was questioning them. He was pushing back, expressing concerns about the legality of the operation. The jury shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had been manipulated. The judge, no longer smirking, tapped his fingers against the bench, his mood shifting from amusement to irritation. The tension escalated further when James requested to enter new evidence into the record. He retrieved a stack of papers, each meticulously organized, and laid them out for the court. The documents contained financial transactions that connected high-profile individuals to the fraud scheme, people who had been completely absent from the prosecution's case. James had uncovered a hidden layer to the conspiracy, one that reached far beyond the courtroom. The judge's expression darkened. The prosecutor, who had been so confident at the start of the trial, was now visibly unsettled. He stammered through objections, trying to discredit James's evidence, but the cracks in the case had already formed. The jury was no longer looking at James as just another defendant. They were beginning to see him as a man who had been set up, a scapegoat for something far bigger than anyone had realized. The entire direction of the trial had shifted, and for the first time, it wasn't James who was on the defensive. It was the system itself. James stood firm as the weight of his revelations settled over the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had walked in with an air of superiority, now struggled to maintain control. His once confident stride became hesitant, his objections weaker. The jury, once leaning toward an easy conviction, now sat rigid in their seats, eyes darting between James and the pile of documents he had presented. The courtroom was no longer just a battleground for James's freedom. It had become an unraveling of something far more sinister, something that powerful men had worked tirelessly to keep buried. The evidence James had introduced painted a picture of deception that stretched beyond him. It revealed connections between high ranking officials, corporate executives, and legal professionals, all conspiring to siphon millions through a carefully orchestrated fraud scheme. James had not only proved he wasn't the mastermind, he had shown that the real criminals were men who sat comfortably behind desks, insulated from the consequences of their own crimes. The prosecution had built its case around a lie, and James had just exposed it for all to see. A murmur rippled through the room as one of the jury members exchanged glances with another. It was clear they were beginning to question everything they had been led to believe. The judge, who had dismissed James with laughter at the start of the trial, now found himself shifting uncomfortably. He had presided over countless cases, many of which had ended with quick convictions. But this was different. This was spiraling out of his control. Then, the case took a darker turn. James revealed that the very investigators who had built the case against him had ignored key pieces of evidence, evidence that would have led to the real perpetrators. He presented an email exchange between two corporate executives detailing their plan to funnel funds through a network of shell companies. The names attached to the messages were not those of small-time criminals. They were well-known figures in finance and politics, individuals with enough influence to manipulate legal proceedings. These were the same men who had ensured James took the fall, believing he lacked the power or resources to fight back. The prosecution was in shambles. The lead attorney, who had walked into the trial fully expecting an easy conviction, now looked pale. He attempted to discredit James's findings, claiming they had been fabricated, but James was prepared for this. He had obtained official verification of the documents, ensuring their authenticity was beyond dispute. The case against him was crumbling, and everyone in the room could see it. But just as James had exposed the corruption, the consequences of his actions began to manifest. News of his testimony spread rapidly, reaching the very people he had implicated. Within 24 hours, one of James's key witnesses was found dead in his apartment. Official reports labeled it a suicide, but those who had been following the trial closely knew better. The timing was too convenient. The lead investigator, the same one who had overlooked critical evidence, vanished without a trace. It became clear that James had not just stepped into a legal battle, he had stepped into a war. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew colder. Security was increased, and for the first time, the judge appeared genuinely unsettled. The prosecutor, once eager to see James convicted, now seemed desperate to put an end to the trial before more truths could come to light. But James wasn't finished yet. He had one final revelation, one final piece of evidence that would shake the courtroom to its core. What happened next would change everything. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted from tense to outright volatile. James had already done what no one believed possible. He had exposed the deep-seated corruption behind the case against him, unraveling a conspiracy that extended far beyond his own trial. But the moment he revealed that a key witness had been found dead under suspicious circumstances, the energy in the room darkened. What had begun as a routine fraud trial was now something far more dangerous. The judge, who had once found amusement in James's decision to defend himself, was no longer laughing. He sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly together, his face unreadable. The prosecutor, clearly rattled, was no longer focused on convicting James. His primary concern now seemed to be containing the damage. James, however, was just getting started. With each new piece of evidence, the courtroom was forced to confront a reality that most had been unwilling to acknowledge. The case against him had never been about justice. It had been a carefully orchestrated deception, designed to ensure that the true architects of the fraud remained untouched. And now that deception was collapsing in real time. The jurors, once certain of his guilt, had become wary, their expressions shifting from skepticism to unease. Some looked over their shoulders, as if suddenly aware that this trial had become something far bigger than they had anticipated. Then, James dropped the final bombshell. He retrieved one last document from his briefcase, a sealed legal agreement that had been quietly buried beneath layers of red tape. It detailed a financial settlement paid out to an anonymous party, money that had been funneled through multiple shell corporations to ensure it never led back to its true source. But the most damning detail was the signature at the bottom of the document. The name written there sent a shockwave through the room. It belonged to none other than Judge Marcus Halloway himself. The silence was suffocating. The same man who had laughed at James, the same man who had presided over his trial with condescension, had been implicated in the very corruption James had exposed. The weight of the revelations settled over the courtroom like a suffocating fog. The judge's face remained eerily still, but his eyes betrayed him. For the first time, fear flickered behind them. The prosecutor, who had spent the entire trial treating James as an unworthy opponent, seemed at a loss for words. But the real consequences of James's revelations didn't unfold inside the courtroom. They unfolded in the world beyond its walls. The moment his evidence became public, a chain reaction was set into motion. Those he had exposed had spent years ensuring their protection, eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their power. James had done more than threaten them. He had dismantled the illusion they had so carefully constructed, and for that, they would not forgive him. 2 weeks after his acquittal, James was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was ruled as a robbery gone wrong. The media framed it as an unfortunate tragedy, another statistic in a city riddled with crime. But those who had watched his trial, who had seen the way he had torn apart the lies woven against him, knew better. The message was clear. Exposing the truth came at a price. James's death sent shockwaves through the legal world, but the system moved quickly to suppress the truth. Official reports painted his murder as nothing more than a random act of violence. His case, once the center of a national spectacle, was suddenly buried beneath an avalanche of other news stories. The media, which had once reported on every detail of his trial, now avoided his name altogether. The prosecutor, who had failed to convict him, resigned quietly, disappearing from public life. The judge, Marcus Halloway, stepped down from the bench, citing health reasons. To the outside world, it seemed like the case had simply run its course. But those who had been paying attention knew better. Despite the efforts to erase James's story, his trial had left a mark that could not be ignored. His relentless defense had not only cleared his name, but had also exposed a network of corruption that stretched into the highest levels of power. Investigative journalists, emboldened by the evidence he had presented in court, began to dig deeper. What they uncovered only confirmed what many had already suspected. James's trial had never been about justice. It had been about protecting the true criminals, men who had spent years manipulating the legal system for their own gain. The documents James had introduced in court, once dismissed as a desperate attempt to save himself, took on new meaning after his death. A group of independent investigators traced the financial transactions he had uncovered, linking them directly to political figures, corporate executives, and law enforcement officials. Whispers of internal investigations began to circulate, and soon indictments followed. The same men who had orchestrated James's downfall now found themselves at the center of their own legal battles. But even as the truth began to emerge, those responsible for James's murder remained untouchable. The case was deliberately mishandled, key evidence went missing, and witnesses recanted their statements under mysterious circumstances. The officers assigned to investigate his death showed little interest in solving the crime, treating it as just another statistic in a city plagued by violence. Yet in death, James became more powerful than he had ever been in life. His case ignited a movement, inspiring countless others to challenge the corruption that had nearly destroyed him. Protesters gathered outside courthouses demanding accountability. Lawyers and activists began pushing for reforms, using James's story as proof of a broken system. His name became a symbol, whispered in hushed tones by those who knew the truth and shouted in the streets by those who refused to let it be forgotten. As time passed, those who had laughed at him in the courtroom, those who had dismissed him as a fool for representing himself, were forced to acknowledge the reality they had tried so hard to ignore. James Carter had walked into that courtroom alone, armed with nothing but the truth, and had dismantled an empire of lies. Though he had paid the ultimate price, his fight had not been in vain. The system that had sought to silence him was now unraveling, and the powerful men who had once believed themselves untouchable were beginning to feel the walls close in.